Hello, welcome to our Monday webinar, Women's Sexual Energetic Anatomy. And today's webinar is on how to end a culture of sexual shame and abuse. So this is a big topic. I am going to attempt to break down some powerful ways that we can shift out of this culture of sexual shame and abuse. And there's probably many more ideas about how to shift out of this. I am totally open to receiving your suggestions and your feedback after any of these webinars. So I've been working in the field of health and sexuality for over 15 years. And as my first slide here says, keep calm and let's talk about sex. So I have this as my first point because I've seen through my own life that everyone seems to have a real difficulty talking about sex. My parents didn't talk to me about sex. At one point, I think one of my parents asked me, well, don't they teach you about that in school? So I think one of the main points to understand is that, yes, it can be very, very uncomfortable for many people. In fact, I would say most people to talk about sex, but that is due to our sexual conditioning. So it's connected to the idea that somewhere along the way in our life, we have learned that sex is wrong or bad from our parents, our friends, our grandparents, our teachers, or our culture. So it's so difficult for us to talk about sex, mostly because of our sexual conditioning and also due to painful experiences that we've had that are largely due to the fact that we haven't talked about sex due to our sexual conditioning. So there's this vicious cycle that keeps going around and around and around. And the less we talk about sex and the less we address this subject as responsible adults, the more we're going to perpetuate this culture of sexual shame and abuse. So the first thing is we need to start talking about sex. My personal path has been one of noticing that the power of the sexuality is very deep and powerful, and it's something that I experienced feeling and sensing in my own body and in my own being growing up. But I noticed that nobody around me was talking about it. I got messages from friends. I had experiences with friends when I was a child. I learned things through pornography, and it felt really powerful to me. But I was always baffled as to why the adults in our life couldn't talk to us about it. It was just like this great big mystery, and I was really curious about it. I had some traumatic experiences connected to the sexual shame side of things, and that ended up staying with me for a long time until I healed it in my adulthood. with some persistence, because these kinds of experiences around sexuality, it's such a powerful force within us. It's something that we're curious about as children, very innocently, because we're curious about our bodies, and we're curious about our friends' bodies, and one of the ways that we find out what is normal is by sharing and by talking, and by, when you're a child, sometimes it's show and tell. So it's very, very normal for children and teens to, try to like share information, because we're all sort of under this umbrella of mystery when it comes to sex. Um, and I found that when I started to learn about Tantra, that I started to learn about information that was really empowering, and it is empowering in a really, really healthy way. And so I'm a Taoist Tantra instructor, and the ancient Taoists, for them, the whole topic of sexuality, and in Chinese medicine, I have another amazing book written by a woman Chinese doctor. The topic of sexuality in the Asian cultures is one of, like, it's about our health. It's a big part of our life. It is our life force energy. It's how we create other humans. So, and it's really magical. So in the Asian cultures, it was a health topic, and talking about sex and learning about sex and studying about it helped individuals to be healthy people. Whereas in this culture, it has been repressed and suppressed, and deemed an inappropriate or a taboo topic of conversation. So, so most people don't know how to talk about sex to their children, to their friends, and to their partners, mostly because of our conditioning and because of some of the experiences that we've had in life. So it's really good to examine our attitudes. So one of the things that we do in the Tao Tantra teacher training, which I am a teacher of, is a little exercise called sexual deconditioning. And it would be difficult for you to replicate it. So another way that we really examine our sexual conditioning and decondition is through examining our history. So this is something that anyone can do, is just get a pen and a piece of paper and answer these questions for yourself. And this can be something that you answer for yourself and then you don't share with anybody else, or it can be something that you might want to share with your friends or with your partner. So some questions like, what were the attitudes about affection, sexuality, and about bodies in your family as you were growing up? So our our formative years are the years 0 to 5. So everything that we learn from about a lot of the aspects of that form our general psychology happen in the formative years. That's why they're called the formative years. So much of our attitudes are formed in these very, very young ages, from 0 to 5 and onwards. What was your first sexual play or sexual experience like? Was it during childhood? Was it during adolescence? Was it alone or with another person? And what feelings did you have about these events or information? What memories do you have of approaching adolescence, of menstruation, of your body's development, of the sexual feelings that arose, or attractions, or lack of any of the above? And what were your feelings at the time? What are your memories of first being kissed or touched, either by the opposite sex, or if you had already identified as as homosexual, by the sex, a person of the same sex? What do you recall about your first love? What do you recall about your first serious sexual involvement? And what were your feelings about these experiences? And how have these experiences influenced your current view of your body or your sexuality? So, as you can see when you go through this type of exercise, so much of our first experiences and the information that we learned make up who we are now and affect our current view or our current relationships. We need to talk about sex because many people don't know what is normal. So this is a comment, or it can be a question that I get in my work, is that sometimes people just want to talk about sex with somebody who works in the industry or has any education or experience around it, or who's open enough to be able to talk to it, because they don't know what's normal and they haven't had an opportunity to ask questions. So that's how we learn. We learn every day by talking to other people about what happens in our lives. And since sex has sort of become this mysterious, private conversation, we don't have a lot of comparison or reflections to bounce off of. So a lot of people don't know what's normal in regards to, for example, body functions. And this can be children, teenagers, it can even be adults. I remember my first curiosity as a 5-year-old, and I remember this experience very clearly, was when my mom was pregnant. I was very curious about how the baby got in her belly, and I got, well, daddy planted a seed in mommy. And that was all well and good, but then my next comment was like, well, what, does it just give it to you and you like put it in your mouth and swallow it? It ends up in your belly. Like, how did it get in there? This is these are like, and basic body functions for children, and then even into adulthood. And I put IE squirting, because I didn't know until the age of 33 that female ejaculation was a thing. I remember hearing something on a sex show that we had in Ontario called Sex with Sue, and someone had called in and said, there's a puddle of water on my bed after I have sex with my boyfriend, and what is that? What is happening? And I guess that Sue went on to explain what female ejaculation was. But I didn't know what it was until I was in my early 30s. So I wondered, how can I get to the age of 33 and not even know what this was? So many people don't know what's normal in regards to, for example, sexual desire. So I've had different clients asking me, is it bad to have sexual desire for people that you're not in a relationship with? So, and this is coming from adults. So there can be all kinds of things that we don't really know what normal is because we haven't shared about it. So that's one reason we need to start talking about sex. Another reason is because education, sexual education, is pretty much hit or miss in Canada. I looked at a report that was sort of analyzing how good the sexual education was. I'm not sure if it was province-wide for British Columbia or if it was nationwide. I have a feeling it was nationwide. Anyway, the summary of the report was sometimes sexual education is decent and sometimes it's not even there. So yeah, we can't necessarily rely on our children or teens learning about sex in school in a good way. And as I mentioned, the formative years are really, really important, 0 to 5 years. Of course, the comprehension of a 0 to 5-year-old when it comes to topics of sex it may not even be appropriate to talk about that, but children at that age are learning about their bodies, and they're learning about boundaries, and they're learning about all kinds of things that their parents are teaching them. And so I think this is a huge topic, and I really want to have the resources to share with people about how to talk to their kids. So I called an old friend from Vancouver, Masters of Sexual Education, Julia Saunders. I knew she was writing sexual education for some provinces in Canada. And it just so happened I contacted her last week, and she wrote a book. So she's creating resources for parents. Her first book, Bodies, Boundaries, and Delight, is specifically for parents and how to talk to children in the formative years, 0 to 5 years. And then her next book will be on children from 5 upwards. So stay tuned next month, and we will be talking to Julia about this resource for parents and just getting more information about how parents can talk to their children about sex. Another reason we need to talk about sex is because media is not always setting us up with good, positive values and information, or helping us to develop positive habits around our body and our sexual relations. And if you have teenagers and you want a bit of a wake-up call, I will recommend a TED Talk called The Unsexy Truth, The Hookup Culture by Lisa Bunnage. And Lisa has an awesome TED Talk. She talks to many, many, many teenagers and also school-age children about sex, and what you will learn in that TED Talk will alarm you. So when parents don't, and when schools don't, when teachers and our elders do not talk to youngsters about sex, they turn to media and they turn to their friends. And a lot of their friends have also learned through media. So we have a bit of an issue because so many of our children and teenagers have access to their own devices, and whether they're being closely monitored or not, or what they have access to on the internet through their own devices, can probably vary from family to family. But the mere fact that a lot of kids are using pornography to learn about sex is probably all in all not positive. And I'll share a little bit more about that on the next slide, because pornography doesn't really show a accurate account of what a real relationship is. And so it kind of brainwashes, it can brainwash people into needing certain types of stimulus or thinking things need to be a certain way. And I've seen from doing medical intuitive assessments, so I do medical intuitive assessments, and when I do medical intuitive assessments, I can see what's going on in the person's mind. So if a person has a belief like, I'm a failure, or I just can't, or I'm a disappointment, I will see what the person's mental picture is of themselves and how that's impacting their health and impacting their life. And I was surprised to see in some of my clients how they were brainwashed basically by their porn addictions. I could actually see it in their mental field. So also another thing that media does is gives a lot of people low self-image because the standards are so high. So media is not the best place to learn about sex, although there is a lot of good information out there, and educational information. It can be hard to sort through, especially for kids and teenagers, what information is good and what information is not good for teenagers. And we also need to talk about sex because many people have deep pain or trauma that creates a big lock within them around sexuality. So one of the things that I'm taking a course about shame, and one of the things that I learned about from that course was a psychologist sharing that quite often a lot of a person's shame that develops when they've been raped or sexually abused doesn't necessarily come from the act itself. A lot of the time, the shame comes from how the people in their life and in their environment reacted to them. So if the people in their life did not support them, then they could internalize the shame so much more. Even police officers, if the police officer interrogated a person who'd been sexually assaulted or raped in a way that made them feel like they deserved it or that they were doing something to deserve it, there's many instances of that happening that creates a lot of shame. So we need to be able to talk to people and also support each other through these types of experiences. Sexual assault will happen to 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 women, 1 in 6 men. So it's very, very common. And we need to have resources to be able to talk to each other about these kinds of things. So I just wanted to share a little bit about this as I was looking for information on pornography. We're hearing a lot about pornography addiction and how pornography affects the brain. And I found this piece of information quite interesting. It's from the website called fightthenewdrug.org. And this is an article, How Porn Affects Sexual Tastes. So since consumers of porn typically become accustomed to the porn that they've already seen and have to constantly move on to more extreme forms of pornography to get aroused, the kind of porn consumed usually changes over time. And there's a little note here: see why consuming porn is an escalating behavior. So in a survey of 1,500 young men, 56% said their tastes in porn had become increasingly extreme or deviant. Just like the rats, they were, earlier in the article, they were talking about these experiments that they did with rats. Just like the rats, many porn consumers eventually find themselves getting aroused by things that used to disgust them, or things that they might have previously considered to be inappropriate or unethical. In many cases, porn consumers find their tastes so changed that they can no longer respond sexually to their actual partners, though they can still respond to porn. Once consumers start viewing extreme and dangerous sex acts, things that they thought were disgusting or degrading can start to seem normal, acceptable, and more common than they really are. One study found that people exposed to significant amounts of porn thought things like sex with animals and violent sex were twice as common as those not exposed to porn thought, as what those not exposed to porn thought. And when people believe a behavior is normal, they're more likely to try it. Research has also found that watching pornography affects attitudes and beliefs towards women and relationships. Porn consumers are more likely to express attitudes supporting violence against women, and studies have shown a strong correlation between men's porn consumption and their likelihood to victimize women. In fact, a 2015 peer-reviewed research study that analyzed 22 different studies from 7 different countries concluded that there is little doubt that on the average, individuals who consume pornography more frequently are more likely to hold attitudes supporting sexual aggression and engage in actual acts of sexual aggression. And then you can see how consuming porn can lead to violence. So yes, this is not how we want to be educated about sex, especially our youngsters. So what else is needed to end a culture of sexual shame and abuse, aside from talking about it more, is learning about boundaries and consent culture. So starting with consent, this is something that I've noticed I lived in Vancouver through most of my 30s and attended UBC. I went on campus at UBC, and I was happy to see that the culture of consent was starting in Canada, because when I went to university, I graduated in 96 from university. There was no mention of consent, and there was literally no information, no talking to us students about consent. This has become a thing on university campuses because people recognize it's an important topic to start talking about. So I'm really happy that this has changed. So sexually healthy adults interact with both genders in appropriate and respectful ways. But do we? And how do we know what appropriate and respectful ways are unless we're taught? We need to learn more about consent, boundaries, and respect for each other. So the definition of consent here on this image, consent is an enthusiastic and a voluntary yes. It is not implied. It is not the absence of a no. So, and it can be revoked at any time. So, and then I liked this also. No means no. Stop means no. Turning away means no. I don't want to means no. Shoving you away means no. Leave me alone means no. Passed out means no. I'm not ready means no. Pushing you away means no. I don't feel like it means no. Being drunk or drugged means no. Get away from me means no. Screaming means no. Don't means no. And crying means no. Yes means only one thing only. Freely given consent where both persons' needs, wants, and desires are an integral part of the interaction. So this was not common knowledge when I was in university. This kind of stuff was happening all the time, getting drunk, and yeah. So the university that I went to was McMaster University, and I was happy to find this very elaborate taking actions to end sexual violence from McMaster University. So congratulations to McMaster University. How do we take action to end sexual violence? First, we learn. We listen to survivor stories. That means we're talking about it. We learn more about sexual violence, about how abusers use power and control, and how different forms of oppression intersect, recognizing rape culture happening every day. What enthusiastic consent looks like. There is so much to learn. We think and prepare. We treat bystander intervention like first aid. We read up on what you could do before situations happen. We talk with friends, we read articles, we brainstorm ideas. So one of the things that they had was this whole great big list of how, if you're like at the bar with your friends and you see a situation that maybe doesn't look so right, like a person's being pressured, or that you have like this whole series of steps that you can go through to go and intervene in the situation, and ask your friend, are you okay? Do you need support? Do you need help? Anyway, there's a whole list of it. So like basically teaming up with your friends and being buddies and learning to recognize what's happening in social situations. You practice your consent skills. And it's not just for sex. It's for asking for a hug or checking to see if you can take someone's photo. These are great ways to practice consent every day. You can speak out. You can create a video, a zine, a piece of art, write a blog post, post articles and infographics, and talk with friends. So basically communicating more about all of this, but all of these topics that affect us. You can take action. Now that you've thought about it, you can use one of your many tools to challenge oppressive or sketchy behaviors, and then support survivors. This is really important. As I mentioned, many survivors are traumatized not only by the event themselves, but by the lack of support that they received from their families and their parents and their friends and those around them, even the law. So listen to survivors, support them, believe them, and ask how you can help. So I was very happy to see these kinds of resources. And boundaries. Boundaries is a huge topic, and I am going to do a specific webinar just on boundaries. When learning about Tantra and studying Tantra, one of the big topics that we go into are boundaries and consent. And boundaries is usually, it's an interesting one because it's not something that we're necessarily taught in school. There may be some teachers teaching about it now, but it's not something that I was ever taught in school. And just learning about what boundaries are, and then you can recognize whether you have boundaries, or if you don't have boundaries, or if you have healthy boundaries or not. So for me personally, boundaries has been a difficult learning curve. It's been something that I've had to work on a lot. I didn't have an understanding that I, didn't have to really do things with people when I was younger, that my body was my own. It's like I didn't have ownership over myself. And what often happens with people who've had sexual trauma is there's a sense that their feet have been sort of like knocked out from underneath them. So they don't have sort of proper grounding and aren't like kind of down in themselves and solid and grounded and connected to the earth. And that really affects a person's boundaries, because what happens as a result of trauma a lot of the time is the person will not be in their body, and they won't recognize what boundaries are because they're not actually feeling themselves. They're up here in their mind more, or they're escaping through the crown of the head into a more spiritual, imaginal realm. So, so this is a common issue. It can be a common issue with people who've had trauma. So what are healthy boundaries in relationships? This is just an interesting chart that you can go through and learn whether you have healthy boundaries or not. So healthy boundaries in a relationship, you can say no or yes when you are, and you are okay when others say no to you. You can say no or yes, and you are okay when others say no to you. So yeah, no problem saying no or saying yes. Unhealthy boundaries would be you can't say no because you're afraid of rejection or abandonment. On the healthy side, you have a strong sense of identity and you respect yourself. On the unhealthy side, your identity consists of what you think others want you to be. So you're more like a chameleon, or we also call this a people pleaser. On the healthy side, you expect reciprocity in a relationship. So you understand that whole give and take. You share the responsibility and the power in the relationship. On the unhealthy side, you have no balance of power or responsibility in your relationship. You tend to be overly responsible and controlling, or passive and dependent. I see a lot of these issues when I do medical intuitive assessments for people as well. This shows up quite a bit. Um, you know when the problem is yours and when it belongs to someone else. So this was, for me, for a little while in my life, my mantra was, that's not my shit. That's not my shit. That's not my shit. I was coming into a realization of when the problem was actually mine and when it belonged to somebody else's. And a lot of the time it belonged to other people, not mine. So if you have unhealthy boundaries, you take on others' problems as your own. So it's not my shit is a good mantra in that case. You share personal information gradually in a mutually sharing, trusting relationship. On the unhealthy side, you may share personal information too soon before establishing mutual trust and sharing. On the healthy side, you don't tolerate abuse or disrespect. On the healthy side, on the unhealthy side, you have a high tolerance for abuse and being treated with disrespect. On the healthy side, you know your own wants, needs, and feelings. You communicate them clearly. I think this is a huge thing for people in relationships. Even just knowing what your wants and your needs and your feelings and being able to communicate them all clearly. This can be an issue for a lot of people. Your wants, needs, and feelings are secondary to others and are sometimes determined by others. On the healthy side, you are committed to and responsible for exploring and nurturing your full potential. On the unhealthy side, you ignore your inner voice and you allow others' expectations to define your potential. On the healthy side, you are responsible for your own happiness and fulfillment. You allow others to be responsible for their own happiness and fulfillment. On the unhealthy side of boundaries, you feel responsible for others' happiness and fulfillment and sometimes rely on your relationships to create that for you. So there's something to think about. On the healthy side, you value your opinions and feelings as much as others. On the other unhealthy side, you tend to absorb the feelings of others. On the healthy side, you know your limits. You allow others to define their own limits. On the unhealthy side, you rely on others' opinions, feelings, and ideas more than you do on your own. On the healthy side, you're able to ask for help when you need it. On the unhealthy side, you allow others to define your limits or try to define limits for others. On the healthy side, you don't compromise your values or integrity to avoid rejection. On the unhealthy side, you may compromise your values and beliefs in order to please others or avoid conflict. So that's a little eye-opener about boundaries. And as I mentioned, I'm going to do a whole webinar on boundaries in itself because it's really a huge topic that I'd like to go into. So just even the exercise, we play the exercise of the yes and no exercise in Tantra. You know, may I touch your shoulder? And we just have to say, you have to keep saying no, 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 no. We have to kind of like, it's for people who don't have boundaries, they have to get the feeling of just what it's like to say no and be okay with saying no. And for people to be able to take no as an answer and be okay with taking no as an answer. So that is a huge exercise that we do in Tantra. And then another exercise that's similar to that has kind of morphed into what we now know is called the Wheel of Consent by Betty Martin. So there's lots of amazing resources on Betty Martin's website. Actually, it's bettymartin.org, not bettymartin.com, I think. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's bettymartin.org. So Betty Martin exclusively has been working with this game called the 3-Minute Game. And when you go to her website, she goes into great detail. So we're not going to go into as much detail as she does here, but I'm going to try to explain the Wheel of Consent to you in a really concise way. And the Wheel of Consent is something that I learned about just within the last year. So it's an amazing resource, and it's an amazing tool to understand consent. The way that I came upon it was I had an experience where I went for a massage. I was in deep need of healing and care. And the person who was massaging me proceeded to make a lot of noises that a person would make if they were taking pleasure for themselves from what they were doing. So like, ooh, yeah, ooh, like, I felt increasingly uncomfortable in the massage because I realized, and I didn't have the mental framework for it. I just felt gross and disgusting. Like, I came here to receive, but this person is kind of like, I don't know, I would have used the word, they're perving all over me. And that didn't feel good at all. But I didn't have the mental framework until I saw this information. So this information gave me the mental framework. They weren't actually giving to me. They were taking from me. They were taking pleasure from me without asking me. So that was unconsensual. Anyway, I'll explain it a little bit to you, but I just want to sort of share the background. So Betty Martin would play this game called the 3-Minute Game, which really helps couples to learn to distinguish between giving and receiving and how they affect your experience of touching and being touched. So first you would do a game where you just had to find an object in the room. So I think they maybe were blindfolded. I think one of the objects of the game was, first you're blindfolded and you're given an object. So you close your eyes and then you just start to feel the object. You spend about 5 minutes like exploring all of the details of this object with your hands. And that initial game is to connect your senses and your feelers with your brain. So first you do that with an object, and then you get into partners. And you have 3 minutes. And the first person goes, they say, how do you want me to touch you? So you would tell me how you want to be touched. Like you might say, would you play with my hair? Would you stroke my hair? Would you massage my scalp? And so I would do that because that's what you want. So I would massage your scalp for 3 minutes, and then you would switch. And so now I would say, how do you want to touch me? And you might say, I want to massage your shoulders. And if that sounds like a good idea, then I'm willing. I'm willing to do that. If you say, I want to touch your breasts, then I might not be willing. So I might not let you do that. So it depends what it is, but you can either be willing or not willing in any aspect of this game. So she learned a few interesting things from playing this game. That it was a little bit like more complicated than she thought. So first, she broke down the experience into this is the person who's receiving the gift. So the touch that's happening is for you. And then this is the person who's giving a gift. And this is what they're giving is for them. It's for them. And then there's the doer, and then down here we have the done to. The done to. So you've got the person doing the doing and the person who's being done to. Okay, you have the person who's receiving the gift and the person who is giving the gift. So what tends to happen is the sort of like what we would sort of traditionally identify as give and receive is here. So this is kind of like a give and a receive. So the person who's giving, like if I say, what would you like me to do? Do you say, give me a head massage? So I am giving you a head massage. I am giving the action. This action is to benefit you. It is to serve you. This is commonly called giving. The question on this side might be, will you give me a head massage? And if I consent, so it's all within the consent wheel, I say, yes, I will. So here's the person over here who's receiving the head massage. They're on the accepting side, commonly called receiving, and they are the ones that are benefiting from the action of the giving, from the action of others. But then there's this other thing that happens. The other question is, how do you want to touch me? How do you want to touch me? So you might say, may I stroke your arm? And that might sound okay to me, in which case I might say, yes, you may. I'm willing in that case to allow you to act as you want with me. So this person is actually then choosing to take pleasure in the form of touch, and they're allowing themselves they're allowing their action of touching my arm to benefit themselves. Okay, so this whole dynamic here is called taking. Even though this person is doing the doing, so there's the action arrow, they are doing the doing. See, they are doing the doing. But the gift is actually coming from this side. So this person is allowing this person to basically take pleasure from touching them. So in the case of my massage, and what happens in a lot of cases where there's touch and sex and all kinds of things in between happening, is that someone may think they are in this box and that they are giving to a person who is accepting. What they may not realize is actually they're not giving for that person's benefit. They are taking for their own benefit, and they haven't really maybe considered asking permission. So they think they're here, and then they think their partner is here. So when I went for that massage, I was definitely wanting to be here, and I was wanting the person to give to me, like, so that it benefits me. But what actually happened was that person was not in the serving, they were in the taking role. And so you can't be in take and accept and receive, because these people are both receiving a gift. So nobody's going to be nobody's going to be is going to be giving in this case. So this is something that happens quite a bit, is nobody's actually giving. This person's taking and this person thinks they're receiving, but they're actually not receiving, and it feels weird. So if that makes sense to you. Other language that we can use, when it's unconsensual, it feels weird, but when it is consensual, it can be amazing. It can be like you are the one that's being ravished down here, and the person who is being allowed to take pleasure is allowed to explore your body, to ravish your body, and they're taking so much pleasure from that. So in relationships, all of these things can happen to create a pleasurable experience. When they're not within this wheel of consent, that is when we get into the shadow side. So if the person who is taking did not get consent, then it's considered they are the perpetrator. They're stealing, they're groping, they're assaulting, they're raping, or they're creating or war. And if there's no consent, the shadow side of this person who is in the allowing position becomes like, oh, they're tolerating it, they're enduring it. They may be called a doormat or a pusher or a victim or passive. Okay, so you see how if there's consent, it can be pleasurable and it can feel like you're being ravished. If there's no consent, you're tolerating and enduring. So, and then of course, in this exchange, you can be the giver. If it's consensual, like, will you? Yes, I will. If you didn't give consent, then you might feel like a slave or a martyr or a rescuer or a do-gooder. On this side, the person who's the receiver, if they don't ask, will you, they may be called a freeloader or assumption of privilege or slavery or entitled. So yeah, so I hope that is fairly clear, and the 3-minute game sounds like a lot of fun, and it sounds like you kind of have to play the game to really understand all of these quadrants of the wheel of consent. And you know, a lot of people, Betty Martin was saying, a lot of people feel really guilty for taking. And that can be a wonderful thing to open up, because they associate taking with all of these shadow sides of taking. But when you're in a consensual connection here, and this person is really opening themselves up and giving themselves to you. In fact, I feel like, you know, a lot of conversations I've had with women, you know, when they're in relationships, they really want to be taken, and they really want to feel that. Or on the flip side, they may be in this situation where they're putting up with it. There's maybe something about the sex that they don't really jive with, or maybe they're getting bored of it, or maybe it's routine or whatever. So they're getting into sort of this realm here where they're tolerating it and they're enduring it, which creates a it's not a nice feeling for this person to be, and it's not a nice feeling for this person to be in, to feel like they're a victim or they're enduring something that they really don't want. So that's where the boundaries come in, being able to know what it is that you want, to know what it is that you like, and all these kinds of games and experiences or tantra workshops can help you to know what it is that you want and what you need, and to um, know uh, how to create a consensual atmosphere with the people that you're with. So, how to respect others, and yeah, to learn about boundaries. So, that was helpful. Yeah, so on that note, it's 7 o'clock, and I hope that that helped you, give you some ideas on how to end a culture of sexual shame and abuse. As I said, we'll be going deeper into a webinar on boundaries in the future. Next month's webinar will be with Julia Saunders, talking about her book called Boundaries, Bodies, and Delight. And I want to invite all parents who have young children to come and watch this, so they can learn a little bit more about how to talk to your child. And I am also developing, because there's a lot that we could talk about too around um, shame. And so I've decided that I'm going to develop a course on how to end sexual shame, because that is a pretty big topic. And yeah, so stay tuned for a course on how to end shame that will have you doing a lot of reflection and activities and all kinds of little assignments and exercises to help you move from sexual shame to bliss and pleasure. So I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and thank you. We'll see you next time.